Sati, the act of a widow setting herself on fire on the funeral pyre of her husband, is still one of the most controversial and emotional topics in South Asian culture. Some people see it as a holy funeral rite, while others think it's a cruel way to hurt women. The act has been illegal many times over the centuries, but it has never gone away entirely. Still, it's important to understand something before we judge it. Understanding the meaning of Sati widow immolation. In the realm of Sati, there are a few distinct varieties. In the beginning, the term Sati was used to describe a woman who, following the death of her husband, engaged in the act of self-immolation, which is defined as setting oneself on fire. She is pure or true is the literal translation of the Sanskrit word sasti, which is where the term Sati originates from. According to Hindu mythology, Sati is a goddess who is married to Lord Shiva. According to the stories, Sati's father was adamantly opposed to Shiva and never approved of the union. Sati rebelled against her father's hatred for her husband by setting herself on fire. This was an act of defiance on her part. Sati is said to have prayed to be reborn as Shiva's wife, as she was in the process of being consumed by fire. Sati was reborn as Parvati after her petition was finally heard and answered. The early Hindus used this narrative as a rationale for the practice of sati, despite the fact that Sati was not a widow by any stretch of the imagination. Both voluntary and forced sati were the two primary types of sati that existed throughout history. In ancient Hindu traditions, the ceremony known as sati signified the conclusion of a marriage. As an act of the utmost passion and loyalty, the wife was following her husband into the next life by setting herself on fire when she committed suicide. It should come as no surprise that not every wife desired to accompany her husband by jumping on the funeral pyre. Over the course of history, wives who voluntarily refused to do so were eventually coerced into dying with their husbands. In spite of the fact that people provided theological justifications for carrying out forced sati, sometimes known as murder, the reality was considerably more pragmatic. In Hindu society, widows were seen to be a burden because they were not considered to have any function to play in society. The reasoning behind this perception was that if a lady did not have any children, who would be able to or would support her? Different types of sati execution in Hindu culture. Over the course of history, there are a number of different tales that explain how sati was carried out. Immolation is involved in the majority of them. In most cases, they represent women either lying down close to the bodies of their spouses or sitting on the funeral pyre of their deceased husbands. According to some versions of the story, the pyre is lit first, and then the widow either strides or leaps into the flames. In some versions of the story, the widow is the one who starts the fire on the pyre after sitting on it. Additionally, the practice could be different from one place to the next. An example of this would be the traveler Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who lived in the 17th century and claimed to have witnessed people in certain locations constructing a little hut. It was then set ablaze after the deceased husband and his widow were placed inside this hut while it was being burned down. In other parts of the world, it was documented that a pit was dug, and then the husband was placed inside of it while he was surrounded by combustible substances. After that, it was set ablaze, and the widow jumped into the raging flames that were happening beneath her. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the executions is the use of huts and pits. It has been observed that it is significantly more difficult to climb out of a burning pit or flee a blazing hut than it is to jump off of a flaming pyre, despite the fact that jumping off a burning pyre is theoretically voluntary. In addition, there were certain approaches that were marginally less torturous. There were instances in which it was acceptable for the widow to consume poison or potent medications prior to being burned into ashes. When the widow was ready to jump into the flames, she would sometimes allow herself to be bitten by a snake or use a sharp blade to open up her throat or wrist. Live burials and sati exemptions. People who have passed away at the age of 2 are the only ones who are burned in the majority of Hindu communities. Burials are only performed on people who have passed away. Despite this, there are certain texts that assert that there was another sort of sati that engaged in the practice of live funerals. Some European stories from different ages describe a form of sati in which the widow was buried alive beside her deceased husband. These accounts are found in a few European chronicles. According to Tavernier's account, the women of the coast of Coromandel were buried beside their husbands, while people danced around them following the ceremony. In spite of the fact that it could be simple to dismiss European tales as attempts to make some Indian practices appear barbarous, the most compelling proof that live burials were carried out is the fact that the Sati Prevention Act of 1987 includes live burials as part of its definition of sati. On account of the fact that this was primarily a Hindu tradition, the practice of sati included a caste component. In addition to that, there were various religious exemptions. The first rule of sati said that it was forbidden for any widow to perform sati if she was pregnant, that she was having her period, or that she was caring for little children. It was also believed that women who passed away under the influence of sati were chaste. As a result, they received additional karma and were assured of a better life in the next life. Consequently, there was a certain drive. In contrast, women who belonged to the highest caste, known as Brahmin ladies, were typically excluded from the Hindu practice of sati. Because they were members of the highest caste, their karma was already at its maximum level, which meant that they were unable to reap the benefits of sati and hence did not need to engage in its practice, conveniently located. The rise and fall of sati customs in India. A lot of people have different ideas about when sati as we know it today first started. There is some proof that widow burning has been going on in this area for a very long time. In spite of this, there aren't many dependable sources that talk about sati in particular before 400 AD. The first solid source to talk about sati is the Greek historian Aristobulus of Cassandreia. In 327 BC, he wrote about his trip to India with Alexander the Great and how wives there would burn themselves with their husbands. Cicero, Nicholas of Damascus, and Diodorus all wrote about similar cases of people setting themselves on fire. At the same time, other Greeks who visited the area, like Megasthenes in 300 BC, didn't talk about the practice. Even in the past, it looks like people in some parts of India were practicing an early form of sati. However, the fact that not all Greek visitors wrote it down shows that it wasn't common yet. Nearly all scholars agree that sati, as we know it today, first appeared in India around the year 400 or 500 AD. Then it slowly spread until it was at its worst around 1000 AD. De Hegia, a historian, says that sati started among the warrior elite, or kshatriyas, and then spread to other castes. One story says that the kshatriyas sometimes took religious rules too seriously, turning what was meant to be a symbolic act into a real one. After that, the practice spread faster and faster during the Middle Ages. The process of Sanskritization is thought to be to blame. This means that higher castes, like the kshatriyas, were the first people to perform sati. Soon after, lower castes started doing it too, hoping to be like their betters. Some historians also think that over time, sati and a different behavior called jauhar became mixed up. Noble women did jauhar, which meant giving up their own lives to protect their honor when they were about to lose a battle. In the past, only the wealthy Rajput caste performed jauhar, but like sati, it slowly spread to the lower castes. These historians think that sati's meaning changed as it became more linked to jauhar. It used to mean strong woman, but now it means good woman. It went from being something that only brave women from high castes should do to something that all good women should do. Sati slowly started to become less popular again after reaching its peak around the year 1000 AD. During the Mughal Empire, which lasted from 1526 to 1857, this process moved faster. Emperor Akbar, who reigned from 1556 to 1605, was said to be strongly against the sati. He said that he respected widows who wished to be cremated with their deceased husbands, but he thought that setting oneself on fire was an inappropriate way to honor a deceased spouse. He also spoke out against abuse and, in 1582, made it illegal to force Sati to do anything. Some historians have even said that Akbar outright banned Sati, but this is not supported by any records. It's possible that the emperor warned people against doing it, but never actually banned it. In 1663, Emperor Aurangzeb ordered that, in all lands under Mughal control, never again should the officials allow a woman to be burnt. This was the first real ban on satis. People from Europe who went to the empire after the ban saw that sati were very rare, unless they were from rich families who could pay off local officials to let them do it. Colonial powers in India and their attitude to sati. It was Alfonso de Albuquerque of Portugal who was the first of the European nations to visit and take control of broad swaths of India. These European countries also made every effort to put an end to the practice of sati. The prohibition of sati was one of the very first things that he did once he had conquered Goa in the year 1510. All of this continued until the year 1555, when Brahmins were successful in persuading Francisco Barreto, who had just stepped off the boat, to lift the ban. This resulted in significant demonstrations from local Christians and leaders within the church. By 1560, the prohibition had been reintroduced, and additional punishments had been imposed on anyone who advocated sati. In their respective strongholds of Chinsura and Pondicherry, the Dutch and the French likewise prohibited the practice of sati within their confines. It wasn't until the 19th century that the Danes, who were the colonial rulers of Tranquebar and Surmapur, finally decided to outlaw the practice of sati. The influence of the British on India has been the subject of a great deal of discussion over the years, and when it comes to the practice of sati, the results have been mixed. In the year 1680, a colonial governor named Stransham Master intervened and prevented the burning of a Hindu widow. This becomes the earliest documented instance of the British government taking action in response to sati. During the same time period, other British officers had made efforts to put a stop to or outright prohibit the practice in their respective provinces. But their superiors at the East India Trading Company, which was not exactly known for its morals, did not support these efforts. As an explanation, the corporation stated that it adhered to a principle of non-interference, and that it had no authority to interfere in matters pertaining to Hindu religious practices. In 1798, the British government issued the first official prohibition, but it was only applicable to the city of Calcutta. The use of sati continued to be relatively widespread in the regions that were nearby. Campaigns against sati were initiated by churches in Britain and their members in India at the beginning of the 19th century. Missionaries in India, who were already working hard to convert as many Indians as they could, started an education campaign with the intention of reducing the practice of sati. The corporation was put under pressure to completely prohibit sati as a result of these activities. The 1829 ban on sati practices in India. During the early part of the 19th century, there was a growing opposition to sati among Christians and Hindu reformers around the world. The problem was that not all Hindus were comfortable with being instructed what to do by a group of people who were not from their own culture. As a consequence of this, there was an increase in the number of occurrences of sati, and the number of deaths caused by sati doubled between the years 1815 and 1818. 1828 was the year that Lord William Bentinck was appointed governor of India. It was made very apparent to him upon his arrival in Calcutta that he considered the prohibition of sati to be his ethical obligation. On December 4, 1829, Regulation 17 was released, officially declaring sati to be an illegal activity that is punishable in criminal courts. This was done despite the warning of some of his advisors who were concerned that it would spark an uprising. As was to be expected, it was met with strong opposition. A significant number of Hindus in India interpreted it as an assault on their customs and way of life. These accusations were mainly disregarded by the British government, and the official position was that there were no more sati incidents after the year 1829. When all was said and done, sati was not entirely absent. There were some princely states in India that continued to engage in the practice for a few more years after the British had lost control of the entire country. By 1852, the majority of the princely kingdoms had followed suit and prohibited the practice of sati. A significant victory occurred in 1846 when the state of Jaipur prohibited the practice of sati. There is a widespread belief that this was the impetus for the states that are located within the Rajputana region to emulate Jaipur's actions. In just 4 months after the ban on Jaipur, 11 of the 18 states that make up Rajputana had also prohibited the practice of sati. Mewar was the last state to pass a law against the practice of sati in the year 1861, and the same year also saw the final court case involving sati within a princely state. Within the latter part of that year, Queen Victoria made an effort to put the final nail in the coffin of sati customs by declaring a general prohibition that was applicable throughout the entirety of India. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.